They always warn you to be careful when camping in the wild. People go missing, drown in rivers, or fall victim to wild animals. But none of those were the real danger that night. What I faced would be from someone, or something, much worse and far more terrifying. Mark and I had been camping together for years. It was our form of therapy, something we did when we needed to get away from the daily business of work, family, and girl drama. That camping trip started out normal. We spent the day hiking some nearby trails, fishing, talking about life, and then making a fire. After we finished dinner, we cracked a beer and sat by the fire. We talked about things we normally did, topics that would probably get us canceled if we weren't so isolated. That's why we enjoyed taking these trips so much. We were able to shit talk with no filter while drinking copious amounts of beer. I know I'm not painting the best image of myself or Mark, but ladies, this is most likely what your boyfriend is doing when he spends a weekend with the guys. Anyway, we had been sitting by the fire for hours. It was probably 2:30 a.m. The beer was flowing and the music had steadily gotten louder and louder, as did we. At some point, Mark said he had to take a leak and stumbled into the tree line only about 10 yards from the fire. Looking back now, he was gone a little longer than usual, but given our state, I didn't think twice at the time. When he emerged from the woods, he walked back to his chair slowly, sat down, and kinda blankly stared into the fire. His vibe had taken a U-turn. When I asked him what was wrong, he just looked at me. His eyes were glossy and dilated. It seemed like nobody was there. Honestly, it didn't seem like he was even looking at me, more through me, or just behind me, if that makes sense. Again, I didn't think too deeply into it. I knew he was having girl trouble at home, so I thought maybe she had texted him with bad news, or maybe he had just drank too much. The rest of the night was uneventful. Mark just sat there with the same blank stare, looking into the fire, not saying a word. I woke up the next morning, head pounding and still kinda out of it. I walked over to Mark's tent and immediately noticed it was unzipped and that he wasn't inside. Before I could turn around, I heard the most high-pitched, blood-curdling screech ring out of the forest. I couldn't tell if it sounded like Mark or if it sounded like an animal. Maybe an animal that had been caught in a trap? I ran into the clearing only 50 feet from our tents to scan the tree line and yelled Mark's name. Nothing. But when I turned around, I saw Mark standing there, just behind the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing from where I heard the scream. He didn't wave, didn't say anything. He just stood there, looking directly at me with no expression on his face. His posture was strange, not his normal posture. It was like he was sticking his chest out and had his shoulders back. He stood with his knees slightly bent. The sight of it was just off, eerie, and unnatural. I looked back at him and yelled his name, but as soon as I did, he turned around and bolted back into the forest. I yelled again, but nothing. I thought maybe he was just messing with me. I ran into the woods where I'd seen Mark, yelling for him to cut it out. After searching for what seemed like hours, I stumbled across a small bird carcass. It was fresh and something had just eaten it. It wasn't until I looked to my left that the frustration turned into fear and panic. Only 20 feet away was Mark's shirt laying on the ground. I picked it up and examined it. It was full of blood and feathers, clearly from the bird that I had just discovered. Truly frightened now, I ran out of the tree line and back to my chair that was still sitting in front of the smoldering fire from the night before. I tried to breathe, to calm down and think of what I was going to do. Here's the problem. There was no cell service where we were. We were too far out. If I wanted to drive back, it was 2 hours to the nearest town. Although I was scared, I decided to stay and wait for Mark, hoping he'd show up. After all, what if everything was in my head and I was freaking myself out for no reason? And then Mark comes back and realizes that I left him? No, I'd stay the night, and if Mark hadn't returned by 6 a.m. the next morning, I'd know for sure something was wrong and I'd drive to get help. I stayed in my chair, feeling incredibly uneasy, paranoid even. It sounds ridiculous, but I felt like I was being watched. My feeling of anxiety got worse, and I was constantly checking over my shoulder at the tree line. I couldn't get the image of what I had seen earlier out of my head. The image of Mark, standing there, blank stare, body contorted. Every time I looked back, I was terrified I'd see the same sight, but it didn't happen. By the time the sun had started to set, my panic somehow increased. I built a fire and stoked it way too much. It gave me a sense of comfort, of security, of safety. I stared at my phone, looking at the time, watching the minutes tick by, waiting until it hit 6 a.m. so I could get out of there and get some help. I considered just leaving then, but the possibility of Mark returning and realizing I left him made me stay. The time on my phone hit 3 a.m., but I wasn't tired. I was still just filled with unease. My brain wouldn't slow down. I was just about to stand up and put another log on the fire when, seemingly out of nowhere, making no noise at all, Mark emerged from the darkness behind me and sat down in his chair. I can't begin to convey how much relief I felt in that moment, but seconds later, my sense of relief turned into dread as I scanned Mark. The sight I saw earlier in the tree line was now right beside me. He was dirty, his cheeks sunken in, his hair greasy, his posture was disturbing. His arms and legs looked bent or somehow broken. He didn't have a shirt or shoes on, and he sat there with a dead stare, head cocked to the left, just staring into the fire, not even acknowledging me. I shook my head and yelled at him, "Dude, what the hell? Where have you been?" His head turned toward me in a jerky motion, the same blank stare. Something was so wrong. Just the sight of him made my blood run cold. He stared at me for a second and then said, "There's something in the woods that I want you to see." Now that comment alone is so bizarre and out of place, but it's the way he said it. It sounded like Mark's voice, but expressionless. And he talked slower. It was like someone else was controlling his body and his voice. Stunned, I sat there and watched him stand up and stagger away from the fire. His body contorted as he walked, and the bones in his back were visible. I swear I could hear his joints cracking as he walked. Then, without looking back at me, he said, "Come away from the fire. I want to show you something over there." And then a pause. "Our friend needs help at the river. He's drowning." None of this made any sense, and my body was vibrating from the insanity that was unfolding in front of me. One thing I knew for sure, this wasn't Mark, and whoever it was, or whatever it was trying to lure me away from the fire. I don't want to think about why. He continued to walk into the darkness, joints cracking, body jerking. In my head, I kept repeating, "Please keep going." At this point, I was more concerned about getting out of there. As soon as he was out of sight, I quietly reached into my pocket, grasping my truck keys. I stood up and quietly walked over to the door. I got in, started it, and got out onto the dirt road as fast as possible, engine revving out and tires spinning. Once I had made some distance, I slowed down a bit. The last thing I wanted to do was slide off the road. The dirt was loose and the road extremely narrow. My yellow headlights illuminated the forest on either side. That's when I saw it again, the horrifying sight that had been stuck in my head. It was Mark, about 20 yards ahead on the right, standing in the tree line, staring directly at my truck. His body looked even more contorted now. His bones clear through his skin, eyes even bigger and darker. The stare he gave me as I drove past sticks in my memory to this day. I knew for sure, whatever that thing was, it wasn't Mark, and it didn't have good intentions. When I got back on the main road, I pulled out my phone and had enough signal to call for help. I explained to the police what had happened, and they immediately launched a search party. They searched that entire area for 3 days straight, but found no sign of Mark, except for his shirt in the tree line. Eventually, they called off the search, and the sheriff's department released this explanation. They said that most likely he had woken up that morning thirsty from the alcohol night prior, and made his way to the river to drink water. They said that it was likely contaminated water, and that was what was responsible for his strange behavior. This caused confusion and delirium, ultimately leading to Mark getting lost and succumbing to the elements. I don't believe this explanation for a minute. I know what happened, what it was, but I'll never say that word out loud, and neither should you. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.